We can now bring in Kurt Volker, former U.S. ambassador to NATO and former U.S. special representative for Ukraine negotiations during Donald Trump's first term in office. Thank you so much for joining us on the program today. Based on what you know, will Vladimir Putin be showing up for these talks in Istanbul?
I wouldn't say it's 100% out of the question. I think it's unlikely. I think that he is very conscious about his own security these days, so he's probably not going to do that. But he could. He's always willing to surprise.
Donald Trump put out a statement on Truth Social earlier saying that Vladimir Putin doesn't want a ceasefire in Ukraine, but wants to meet. European states like Germany say that there needs to be a truce first. Are the U.S. and Europe still disconnected when it comes to how this war ends?
Well, I think that the U.S. has insisted on a ceasefire first, gotten Ukraine to agree to that. Now the U.S. and Ukraine have jointly called for that. Now Europe has climbed on and said, yes, we have to have a ceasefire as well. This is all very, very good, and I think creating a bit of a box for Vladimir Putin. Now, Putin wants to wiggle out of that box by saying, oh, I'll have a meeting, we'll have negotiations. And Zelensky is indeed calling his bluff. And your correspondent was focused on whether Putin shows up or not. He may not. More significant is that Putin actually doesn't want a ceasefire. And he says he wants to address root causes. But the root causes of this war is Russia itself. It's Russia's decision to invade Ukraine. And it is occasioned by their belief that Ukraine should not be a sovereign and independent state, by their belief that Ukrainian is not a national language or identity or character and doesn't have a right to exist, that Ukraine should not have a separate military force, that the Ukrainian government should be directed and determined by Moscow. These are all unreasonable demands by Russia, and those are the root causes of the war. And the war would end if Russia simply stopped.
Now, Russia would argue that one of the root causes of the war would be NATO membership. Given that the Trump administration has effectively ruled this out for Ukraine, would that precondition be palatable for Vladimir Putin?
Look, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, has never been invited to join NATO. It was not moving into NATO in 2014 when Russia invaded the first time. It was not moving into NATO in 2022 when Russia invaded the third time. And it is still not being offered NATO membership. So this is a false narrative from Putin that we should not pay any attention to. And the worst thing that we should do is make a commitment today about the future, giving Russia a veto over Ukraine. That is not something that Russia should have a right to do over another sovereign independent state.
Now, Europe says that if there's no ceasefire reached in Ukraine by the end of the day, they will prepare a new packet of sanctions to hit Russia with. The Kremlin says it's unacceptable to speak to Moscow with ultimatums. Could European states risk scuttling a meeting or any breakthrough?
No. In fact, if they're preparing additional sanctions, it makes you wonder why they didn't do it before. This war has been going on for 3 years and 3 months. What are we waiting for if those are there? And moreover, Russia will always use excuses if it doesn't want to make peace. So whatever Europe does, Russia will use that as a reason to keep the war going. What we need to focus on is our own actions and what might actually put real pressure on Moscow, pressure that should have been applied, as I said, even a couple of years ago.
I want to talk about the effectiveness of sanctions in just a second, but first I want to talk about security guarantees, because Paris and London, as you know, with the coalition of the willing, have been toying with the idea of keeping essentially boots on the ground of NATO member states like France, like the United Kingdom, to oversee whatever ceasefire deal is reached in the short or medium term between Russia and Ukraine. Is Russia going to accept that at all?
Why should Russia have a say? Russia has decided to invade and conquer territory from a neighboring country because it did not feel deterred. It felt that it could get away with it. what we need to focus on is if we can get a ceasefire, which is still a big if, whether we can get a ceasefire, how do you deter Russia from attacking again in the future? And a deterrence force, such as Starmer and Macron are talking about, could be a component of that. But just giving in to Russian demands that there be no military protection for Ukraine, either by Ukrainians or West Europeans, is simply setting up the stage for Russia to take more of Ukraine.
But would the United States be involved in that is the million-dollar question.
Well, I think that what the United States and Donald Trump are doing is holding back any commitments, partly to facilitate ceasefire negotiations, but also to keep maximum pressure on Europe to do as much as Europe can do. If the United States were to come out and say, we will do X, Y, and Z, then Europeans would organize themselves around the United States. What the U.S. wants to do is make sure that Europe puts on the table as much as it can do, and then the U.S. could perhaps fill gaps or backstop.
You mentioned about if Europe had tricks up its sleeves when it comes to sanctions, why haven't they done it up until now? But with sanctions, with all the sanctions we have seen, we've sanctioned oligarchs in the early days of the war, thinking that would influence Vladimir Putin's thinking. That hasn't. This conflict has gone on for over 3 years now. Do you think sanctions have been effective, even the sanctions that we have seen in force up until now?
I think they've been effective up to a point. They've made it harder for Putin to get access to hard currency. He is in a budget deficit. He's having to work hard to get access to technology and to military equipment. Look, he's relying on North Korean artillery shells and soldiers and Iranian drones. And I think if we had been more bold earlier, we could have had an even greater effect. For example, the Biden administration exempted Russian banks from sanctions if they were being paid for energy, because they wanted to keep gasoline prices down in the United States. Well, that's really not a very serious effort to impose sanctions. They lifted that, and that has already tightened under President Trump. But we really should be going after the secondary sanctions on those people who are buying and reprocessing and selling Russian oil and gas, the ships that are moving Russian oil or gas around, and the financial institutions that are collecting the money.
Over the weekend, we saw that Donald Trump, his mediation led to a ceasefire agreement between Pakistan and India. Why do you think the U.S. president has had a tougher time striking a deal between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, because India and Pakistan actually want a ceasefire. Vladimir Putin doesn't want a ceasefire. I think in the case of India and Pakistan, you had some terrorists attack people in Kashmir. The Indian government responded to that by hitting the Pakistani military, saying, you've got to keep your guys under control. The Pakistani military hit back simply out of a matter of prestige. They can't allow themselves just to be hit. But now both of them want to stop this. And so it's fairly easy to have a ceasefire between India and Pakistan. In the case of Putin, he still wants to attack Ukraine, replace the Ukrainian government, eliminate Ukrainian national identity, and conquer and control as much territory as he can. He's not giving up on that.
Kurt Volker, thank you very much for joining us on the program today.
Thank you.